What happens when an outdoor enthusiast and evolutionary ecologist experiences Lyme and other tick-borne illnesses firsthand? Well, naturally, she dives into the peer-reviewed research and writes a book about it. And then she joins the board of the Canadian Lyme Disease Foundation. Dr. Shelley Ball is an evolutionary ecologist, a fellow of the Royal Canadian Geographical Society, and she participated in the inaugural Homeward Bound Women in Science expedition to Antarctica in 2016. We reached her in Westport, Ontario. Welcome to our Looking at Lyme podcast, Dr. Ball.
Hi, Sarah. Thanks so much for having me. I really, really appreciate the opportunity to chat with you.
How did you become involved with Lyme disease?
Unfortunately, I became involved with Lyme disease as a person suffering from Lyme and other tick-borne illnesses. Wasn't a choice, but it found me. And, so I'm a former research scientist and a university professor and kind of a knowledge sponge. And I think my way of dealing with problems is just to gain as much knowledge on a topic as possible. And as I have learned, the unfortunate and very hard way with Lyme is that you need to self-educate and do your research because we don't get the help from our, public healthcare system that we need. So you very much have to self-educate and become a very vocal advocate for your care.
Yeah, I have a copy of your book. The publisher sent me a copy from Firefly Books, and the title of the book is Lyme Disease, Ticks, and You. And I must say, I was quite amazed that you pulled this book together in the amount of time you did, because I've been sick a lot longer than you, and I could have never pulled anything like this off.
I think it's pure determination, right?
Well, I think it's really valuable, though, to have the scientific perspective and a Canadian scientific perspective. So why did you decide to put your time into writing this book?
A really good question. And honestly, I think it really comes down to I just desperately want to help people because I'll be honest, I have been to hell and back with Lyme disease and two other tick-borne illnesses, as well as mold infections. And I continue to. I mean, we know that treating Lyme, especially those of us in chronic Lyme, is a very, very, very long marathon, not a sprint. As a research scientist, as I said, I'm just a knowledge sponge and I want to know, I want to solve problems, right? And so because of my science background, I'm not a Lyme researcher, I am an evolutionary ecologist and population geneticist, but, as a scientist, I have the ability to read the peer-reviewed science papers that are out there and to read them from a very critical eye. And so, it was just natural for me to delve into the scientific literature and learn as much as I possibly could. And unfortunately, I found that I had to literally turn to the current scientific literature in order to get treatment. I have a wonderful GP. I really respect her. She's excellent. But I really had to fight for a Lyme diagnosis. And because as we sadly, many of us with Lyme know that you get a negative Lyme test and then your doctor says, well, you don't have Lyme. And I think on my third appointment, I walked into her office with about a 12-inch stack of printouts of peer-reviewed science articles and said, here's why I can have Lyme disease, but the test is negative. And she was great. We sat down and we had a, heart-to-heart conversation. And she said, well, let me test you for other things to rule them out. But I said, fine, but just give me some doxycycline. And she gave me as much as she possibly could as a GP.
Yeah, I mean, that's such an interesting observation. I mean, this dialogue between science and medicine is ongoing, and sometimes people are speaking different languages.
Absolutely. I think that's actually a really great way to put it. And kind of coming back to why I wrote the book, that's basically why I wrote it, was because, there are some fabulous books about Lyme disease out there. And I've been gobbling those up and reading them and rereading them and rereading them, right? Because they're big books and you get something different out of them each time. But as a science communicator, something that I'm really big on is how do we take science, especially complex science, because Lyme is complex, right? And science is still learning new things about it. So how do we take that And how do we boil it down into a way that the general public can understand it and consume it? And so, there are lots of really fantastic books about Lyme out there, but some of them are pretty technical. And, and as you probably know, when you have Lyme brain and you can't read, you can't process information, your short-term memory is shot. Even for me, it was tough slogging at some points. And I thought, if I'm at times struggling with this, imagine what the average person is going through. So, I'm very much a, when life hands you lemons, make lemonade. Although, throw a bit of vodka in it, but, it's, so I really tried to take a lousy situation and say, well, how can I use my science background to help other people? Because this is just, it was such a shock to know that, those of us in chronic Lyme have no support from our publicly funded healthcare system. And you really do have to just educate yourself, learn, and be a very vocal advocate for yourself. And I thought, well, I have the skill to do that because of my science background, but what about people who don't? And then the other part of it, so that's why I wrote the book. And when I discussed it with Firefly Books, I said, I don't want to recreate what's already out there. I want a primer. I basically want to give people, what are the absolute fundamentals that you need to know to help yourself? And then for all the other details, go to those other great books that are out there. But this is I wanted to write almost like a starting point, like a quick reference guide. And then the other part of that was, as many, if not most of us with Lyme disease and other tick-borne illnesses go through, it's other Lyme sufferers or, those close to Lyme sufferers that become your biggest support and your biggest help. And I've had massive support from, a lot of people. And for me, the book is kind of a way to pay it forward.
Oh, that's amazing. I know this next question is the right question for you because you studied evolutionary ecology and population genetics. I'm sort of going back to my university science classes, and I saw this section on the taxonomy of Borrelia. And I thought, wow, this is a great question for you because, when I read through that, you speak about the fact that there's 52 different species of Borrelia, and then you also speak about strains and genetic diversity. And I can see that you've also linked it to, understanding why testing is not accurate yet for Lyme testing. So
exactly. And I think this is such an important part of the story and one that doesn't get, perhaps as much attention as it should be. And especially with testing in Canada and probably the US as well. But obviously, I'm most familiar with our system here in Canada, but like if we're using tests to detect certain species, are we missing things? And we know that between, the movement of migratory birds and just human travel, people traveling to other countries and potentially getting Lyme there and then coming back home and testing negative because it was a different strain or different species of Lyme disease. A lot of it obviously depends on the kind of test that you use, but we test for, basically one species and one strain here. And I don't think science has the full understanding of the genetic diversity either at the species level or the strain level, for Borrelia. And, how do we develop the best tools to detect these infections when, we're not even sure about the genetic diversity out there. And so thank goodness, there's science happening that's looking into this, but there's obviously still more for us to learn.
Absolutely. Now, I've looked at your bibliography, which is just rich with peer-reviewed scientific articles. So for those people who are really looking for the hard science on this, I highly recommend going there. Do you have any favorite peer-reviewed scientific articles that you referenced in your book?
Ooh, that's a tough one. Gosh, without kind of like referring to like, specific, sort of specific papers and names and dates and that sort of thing, because as those of us with Lyme brain, our short-term memory is shot, right? But I think some of the papers that perhaps were the most important to me, certainly there was a paper that was a meta-analysis of the efficacy of the two-tier testing. That showed that, the two-tier testing that we use here in Canada, for example, if you have Lyme disease, the probability that those two-tier tests will detect it is 54% on average. And that's based on a meta-analysis of, can't remember if it was something like 17 different peer-reviewed research papers. And I think, it's science runs on consensus, right? We we come up with observations, we ask questions, we test them, we collect data, and, we're constantly sort of revising our knowledge and our perspective. And, I think when enough of a body of scientific peer-reviewed literature is accumulated that we can then do a meta-analysis, I think those are really important because it kind of gives us a sense of, well, what overall are we finding? And when you find that the tests that, we're using to detect Lyme disease, it's almost equivalent to a coin toss, right? Part of it has to do with in which phase, which stage do you test Lyme? Because the efficacy of those tests, does vary sort of over the different phases. But, I think it just sort of underpins a really important message, which is that, these antibody tests were never designed as diagnostic tests. They were surveillance tests. And so,
exactly.
The fact that doctors rely on them far, far too much, we should be relying on a clinical diagnosis. And there's that 2012 bulletin from the Public Health Agency of Canada, or Health Canada, that is advice to doctors that says, and this is back in 2012, that says, especially the first test, the ELISA, is really insensitive, and don't rely on it. Use it as a support tool, but your diagnosis should be clinical. And yet, far too many of us are experiencing the opposite, where I've never had a bullseye rash, and I've been bitten a number of times. And actually, out of the number of times I've been bitten, I've only ever had one rash, which I thought was a spider bite because it was a solid red oval. And, and then I also recently read a paper, that looked at the incidence of that bullseye rash in folks, and it was found to be about 9%. So when doctors in public health say, look for the bullseye, had I known that a solid red rash was not necessarily a spider bite, I could have saved myself a whole lot of grief.
Yeah, well, you bring up so many great points there. So I'm going to just reinforce something we've talked about on our podcast before. So for one thing, you are a board member at CanLyme, and thank you so much for your service. We really appreciate it. But CanLyme is offering grants to physicians who do want to get more training in Lyme disease and other tick-borne illnesses. So we do have grants available to do the fundamentals course through the International Lyme and Associated Diseases Society. And we have that information on our Looking at Lyme website. But it really is so important to understand how to do a clinical diagnosis. And Dr. Betty Maloney has talked about that on our podcast as well, and really just talks about the importance of, you can't rule Lyme disease out with our current testing. So it always has to stay on the differential diagnosis for patients.
Absolutely. And I think that's such an important message for our medical doctors, for our physicians to understand. And as we know, unfortunately, doctors aren't receiving what I would consider adequate training in med school about how to diagnose and treat Lyme disease. So I think we really need to go down to, sort of basics and say, well, what are we teaching our doctors in training? And, I think, one of the biggest frustrations for me is that, the body of peer-reviewed science for Lyme and tick-borne diseases has, literally exploded in recent years. And yet the way that our medical, profession in Canada, and I think in general in North America, treats Lyme diseases, they basically ignore all of that science. We just look at the IDSA guidelines, and they don't reflect the current peer-reviewed science. And so, I think we really need to force the issue to say, look, it's time to play catch up. It's time to, utilize the current information so that we keep people safe, because a lot of the information that doctors and public health will tell you, unfortunately, lead to a lack of a diagnosis, which means that critical window for treatment right after a bite is missed.
Absolutely. And, I think it's all part of this advocating that you speak about in your book as well. And I think if people have good relationships with their doctors, you can advocate for yourself and ask them to go do this training. The training doesn't take long. It's all offered virtually now because of, COVID and everyone having to pivot. But, you can ask your doctor to go and get more training. There's nothing wrong with taking that approach as well as part of your advocating for yourself.
Absolutely. And, I think that's absolutely fantastic advice. And I think, it's unfortunate that, those of us with Lyme, and especially chronic Lyme, which isn't actually recognized as a real disease, by our medical profession in Canada, sometimes it means that our relationship with our healthcare providers is adversarial. I don't like that. And I don't think it's the most productive way to proceed. But unfortunately, sometimes that happens. But having a great relationship, especially, with your family physician, your GP is important. And I think, in all due respect, I think we need to be willing to challenge them in a constructive and a respectful way, but to say, I'm not so sure about this, and I want you to do some more digging. We're, as patients, we're not just at a doctor's mercy. It really should be a collaboration, right? And I
right.
personally think that's true of any medical care that we get. I'm not saying that I'm an expert, and I'm certainly not a medical doctor, but if I hear something that just kind of doesn't sit right with me or doesn't sound like common sense, I'm willing to ask questions about it, and I think we all should be.
Definitely. And I mean, there's nothing wrong with getting another opinion. And, in my case, and I think in your case too, I ended up going to the States and, paying for somebody to care for me and give me another opinion. And it was such a relief to finally see a doctor that knew anything about Lyme disease.
Isn't that wild? It's
is.
actually amazing, kind of the sense of relief and almost kind of validation that you feel, because so often you're told, oh, it's all in your head, or I end up going to a private clinic in Ontario. I was ready to go to the US, but was lucky enough to get into this other clinic. And what's great is that I have a medical team that looks after me, but the medical doctor, the MD who leads that team and who takes care of me, we have conversations on the phone, when I have appointments and things, and I can ask him any question, and I can say to him, well, I'm not so sure about this, so explain it to me. Or I can say, well, I also have this other symptom, and so, I'm thinking maybe the babesia hasn't gone away. And he says, okay, well, let's chat about it. And then, and then it helps him do his job, right?
Right. And you're engaged with curiosity instead of just being shut down.
Exactly.
Yeah. And in Ontario, there is a new program that was just launched this year called Tick-MD, which is a virtual healthcare project or program. And so that's just launched as well. So it's nice that there's that opportunity for people in Ontario now too.
I think that's fabulous. I think we need more of these kinds of tools to help people. And I just, every time I see a program like that, or as you say, like the doctor training program, I think those are huge positive steps forward.
So quickly, I just want to go back to your book. You had a really great chapter on how to check for ticks, and you talked about specifically looking for ticks on your children and on your pets. Do you have any tips for our listeners?
Develop new habits. Do this daily. I mean, I basically do it from essentially the beginning of March until December. I live in Eastern Ontario near Westport, so between Ottawa and Kingston, and I live in a hot spot. There's an area not too far from me where some sampling was done, and it was by University of Guelph, and they found that 80% of the ticks sampled were Lyme positive. So, and my backyard for the past 6 years has been just crawling with ticks, and I've had to, sort of tweak my lifestyle and adopt new habits. I think one thing that's really important is, for the friends who have kind of watched me go through this Lyme journey and frankly have seen me suffer dearly, some of them have said, there's no way I'm going outside again. And my response to them is, that's not helpful. We know that there are physical and mental health benefits of spending time in nature. And, and I'm a biologist and an environmental educator. And my entire goal is to connect people to nature and to inspire them to care about it and protect it. And if we feel chased indoors by ticks, that's not going to help. So my alternative, I'm very solutions oriented. And so I say to folks, well, how about just adopting some simple things that we can do? So, spraying yourself with, with a repellent. And so, I'm a sort of heavy user of Icaritin. We know that DEET's not very effective against ticks. It doesn't last that long. And the Icaritin, lasts longer, up to 12 hours. It's safer, it doesn't dissolve, the strap on your plastic strap on your binoculars. I'm constantly in my backyard. I live in beautiful Canadian Shield country. And so I'm outdoors, every day. And as soon as I come in, I do a tick check. And then I do a tick check again at bedtime, just in case I missed anything when I came in. And then I tell people, I actually do a tick check in the morning. And they go, well, why? You were asleep. You weren't outside. And my kind of philosophy or my thinking there is, some of these, especially nymph ticks, right? The nymphal stage can be super tiny, the size of a freckle or a poppy seed. So they're easy to miss. And so, if you missed it on your tick check at night, if you check in the morning, you may actually, especially if that tick's been feeding on you, it's going to be larger. And so you're more likely to detect it. The other thing too, is that if you're like me and you have pets that sleep with you, well, if a tick comes in on a pet and then your pet sleeps with you and then overnight the tick decides to abandon ship and crawl onto you, you wouldn't have caught it the night before, but you sure will in the morning.
Exactly. What do you hope readers will come away with after reading your book, Lyme, Ticks, and You?
I think kind of three main things. One is that I hope they just get the kind of the basic science of Lyme disease and tick-borne illnesses, so that they know how to protect themselves, but also that they know how to advocate for themselves. Because as we know, our medical system is not particularly friendly towards those of us, especially with chronic Lyme. And so you absolutely need to know the basics of Lyme to advocate for yourself. I want people to adopt these measures to protect themselves from tick bites, to try to minimize it so that they can get outside and enjoy them. I want to make them aware of kind of like just sort of the truth of Lyme, not the stuff that unfortunately that we're getting from public health and from our doctors. And I don't say that with any, malicious intent. It's just that, the information that they're often sharing is so outdated. And so I really did strive to put, the most recent science in this book so that people can understand it and have information in there about, how to get help, how to get a diagnosis, where to turn to. And I think the other part of it, although it's not a huge focus of the book, part of the reason why I started off with my own personal story is I do want people to understand that even though we live in a country with a universal healthcare system, we don't. And that those of us with chronic Lyme are sadly, actively discriminated against in terms of treatment. I mean, I've spent close to $30,000 out of pocket in under 2 years for diagnosis and treatment, and I've just basically killed my retirement, and it's frustrating. And I think, as I say, I don't sort of share any of that with any malicious intent. It's just that it is the truth. And I think people need to know about it because I think we need, there's a lot of wonderful people who have been advocating for Lyme patients for many years and have made great inroads. But I think it's time now that the general public understand what's going on and to help us advocate for change in a positive and collaborative way.
Oh, that's so great. Well, I want to just thank you so much for your time and your expertise, and mostly thank you for doing all the research and putting it into this fabulous book. We will post a link on our website, and people can go there to learn more and get the scientific background. And I just think the more perspectives we have trying to solve this problem, the quicker we get to a solution.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And I think, we really need to work collaboratively with the medical community and the research community to move things forward. And I'm hopeful that we will get there. I mean, it's been a hard slog so far, but, I really hope that, we can continue to raise more awareness about Lyme disease and other tick-borne illnesses. It's not just Lyme, right? Sadly, a lot of us know that, the impacts of having other tick-borne illnesses that the ticks around me carry, such as, Babesia and Bartonella and those sorts of things. So, I really hope that we can educate the public, but also, really get them on board to help us to advocate with our medical profession in Canada so that we move forward in a positive way.
Great advice. Well, we will get there. We'll keep pushing forward.
You bet.
Thank you for your time.
Thanks so much, Sarah. It's great to meet you.
I was fascinated to hear that the University of Guelph has been doing surveillance in Eastern Ontario, and the majority of ticks they sampled tested positive for Lyme. With leadership, medical collaboration, and research from scientists like Dr. Shelley Ball, we are moving forward to a solution. This is our final podcast for Season 2. Have a fabulous summer playing outside, and just remember, stay safe.